Hello, everybody. My name is Gary London. I am Senior Principal of London Moeder Advisors. And I have with me a special guest, Josh Ohl from CoStar. Introduce yourself, Josh.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me, Gary. My name is Josh Ohl. I'm a Senior Director of Analytics at the CoStar Group. Been here for about 20 years and just studying the market, understanding the market, and trying to provide a picture of what's happening at any time in across all the property sectors. So I'm really happy to be here today, Gary. Thanks a lot.
And I appreciate you joining me. As always, what this is a conversation between me and my buddies. You know, Josh and I have regular conversations about the state of the office market, and we thought we'd invite you into my den and share that conversation with you. And today, what we're going to do is highlight the office market, because that is a market that everybody, at least in the commercial sector, is talking about right now, because we are at an inflection point in terms of office market inventory in this nation. And so I thought what we would do today is talk about where we stand in the office market nationally, regionally, locally, offer some stats. You're the stat guy. And then talk about what some of the implications of that are. So sound good, Josh?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Okay. So basically, let me start the conversation by suggesting this. There's probably in the nation right now, order of magnitude, 1 billion square feet of empty office space. And that translates to, according to other people, not me, but people that add these things up, probably about $1.4 trillion in debt. And this is unsecured debt, which is to say, at some point, if this empty office space doesn't get filled, or even if it does, but not enough, the keys get thrown back to the lender, because these are practically all unsecured loans, meaning that, if you built the building or own the building, you didn't sign your own name, it's non-recourse. It's very different than the residential market. And basically what's going to happen is, there'll be a flight to a lower economic base value of these properties, and then they'll get traded. So we're going to talk about sort of the dynamics of how that plays out. But I thought we'd sort of, set the table by, talking about what this means nationally in terms of the markets. Essentially, if you go to the major markets, Josh, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and then you come to the West Coast, Los Angeles and San Francisco, you see about the same kind of thing. Case in point, San Francisco, the vacancy right now is reported at about 30%. And that's not unusual. That's pretty much where the markets stand right now, right?
Yeah, and I think we've touched on it in the past, like that's the headline vacancy, but we know there's a lot of shadow space out there that's not being counted. So we might add another 500 basis points to that headline number. And to your point as well, I think we're tracking somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1.5 billion square feet of office space that's currently available right now. And to give you context, we sort of have our lowest amount of occupied office space since the beginning of 2017 right now. And that's come while office use and employment has grown about 12%. And you talked about LA, and it's sort of an interesting stat. And so in the aggregate, we're occupying about a market the size of Los Angeles, or occupying less space now than what we would anticipate based on office use and employment, about the size of LA, which is about 450 million square feet. So there's definitely a shock to the system.
By the way, I have a little parable about Los Angeles. We do a lot of business in LA. I was in LA, I guess it was about a month ago, in a law firm that I'm working with right now. And this is in one, I'm going to be a little circumspect here. I'm going to leave out the names of the guilty or the not guilty, but I walked into this office building, which is one of the largest office buildings, one of the most prominent buildings in downtown Los Angeles, and into this law firm. And I walk into the lobby and there's nobody there. And it was a Wednesday, and the senior lawyer who met me, who I had the meeting with, said this was actually the day where the senior partners had mandated that everybody be in the office, the flex space thing where they have to at least show up, and still nobody was there. The bottom line was, I don't exactly know how much office space this firm occupied, but it was six figures. It was over 100,000 feet. and they had been in this building since its inception, since it was built, and their lease is about to run out over the next year or so. And he said to me, under no circumstances are they going to lease that amount of space. They're going to compress their demand for space for reasons that we'll get into in a moment. And the likelihood of staying in that building was pretty low. In other words, they're going to move somewhere else in a smaller amount of space. So that's sort of the hidden thing that you were talking about. We can talk vacancy rates all we want, but there's a lot of space that's where rent is being paid, but people aren't sitting at right now. And that probably, I don't know if it's an exaggeration to say that it doubles the inventory of vacant space, but it certainly adds, a great deal of increased vacancy to the marketplace. So we're sort of we're on the precipice of what potentially is a commercial debacle, and it plays out the same everywhere in the country.
Yeah, I think across the country, there's about 50 million square feet more than what's the norm as far as occupied space that's available for lease. And that's, you just have these shell, it's interesting on Wednesday, it doesn't really matter sort of what back to work barometer you might measure, whether it's Castle or ridership data or you, but Wednesday seemed to be the peak day in the office. And it's sort of telling that you're in that office on a Wednesday and there was nobody there. And I think that speaks to the challenge of how much time is going to be spent in the office. I think it's held pretty consistently somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 days, 3.5 days in the office. The other days are at home for those companies that can make that work. And it's much more of a top of the market sort of issue where it's the larger companies that are employing that model more readily. But it's pretty sticky for this point. For over a year now, basically your back to work measures are 50 to 60%, not much more than that. And that's sort of, I think, why we are in this position that we find the office market in right now. I think there had been the idea that maybe if we were going to run into a recession or more sort of economic headwinds, that would give employers more leverage to bring employees back to the office. But so far, we're not seeing that. I mean, we can probably go back to, Labor Day. It always seems like Labor Day is the demarcation of the year. After Labor Day, we're bringing everybody back to the office. That's what all the FANG companies say and all the big tech companies. But you get to Labor Day, well, maybe we'll get them back to the office 1 or 2 days. And then there's a revolt from the employees. And it's just a very challenging market right now.
Let's get back to that in a minute. Before I want to make sure that we get all the stats out. So just let's get this down. You and I are sitting in San Diego, we're just a few blocks from each other, actually, near downtown. So share with us some of the San Diego stats.
All right. So San Diego, our vacancy is about 11%. So we actually find ourselves in a much better.
Not so bad.
Yeah, not so bad when you look at an LA, which is 15%, the country, which is at about 13.5%. Our vacancy is only up about 200 basis points since the end of 2019, whereas the US is up about 400, LA is up about 500 or so. It's just the weight of available space. We have about 7 million more square feet available now than we did at the end of 2019, pretty much.
This is an inventory of about what, 40, what's our total inventory?
We have about 119 million square feet total.
And then Class A is what, about 41?
I'm sorry?
Class A space in the county is what, about 40?
Yeah, about 41 to 45 in that neighborhood.
And this is an office market that has experienced, at least countywide, significant growth. My stats coming from CoStar, suggests that we've had about 19% growth in total office space since 2004. We've added almost 20 million square feet to the market. So it's been a pretty dynamic market over the past 20 years.
It has been. Speaking of office space coming to market, like we find ourselves in this office environment, right, with these sort of headwinds, and we're about to get loaded with the most amount of inventory or speculative inventory that we've seen in probably 20 years. I think you mentioned it the other day that downtown hasn't had a new speculative tower property really built since 2020, maybe in 20 years, right? 2001, somewhere around there. And then we saw, a property on Kettner come online. We saw the property on B Street come online. And now we have the campus at Horton, Holland Partners project on Union, and then not to mention the RAD development from IQHQ, which is all a lot of space.
Well, I added your numbers up. And from my calculations, we're looking at coming on board properties that are actually under construction in downtown. And by the way, the downtown inventory is a little bit over 14 million square feet. And as you just suggested, it's been a little over 14 million square feet for many, many years. And we're about to add about 2.7 million square feet to a downtown market just at the time when we're feeling these vacancy rates. And the vacancy rates downtown currently stand at what?
26.5, 27%.
Yeah, and that's the reported again. That's the reported rate. So what do you think? What's the dirty little secret? What do you think the real rate is downtown?
I think we're probably closer to 35, if I had to guess. I'd say probably not quite 10, but I think 35 feels about right.
By the way, what is it in UTC?
UTC, we're at about 10%, 9.5% right now. And that's almost double what it was at the end of 2019.
Yeah, so it's a much stronger market. Technology, life science, near some of the more affluent coastal markets, but it's still experienced double-digit vacancies.
And we've seen a lot more new supply come on UTC, which is, I think, one of the trends, right? It's the flight to quality, but it's not necessarily the flight to everything that's high end. It's more the flight to what's new. And UTC definitely has that. We'll see if downtown has it, but obviously downtown is trying to capture demand that's more of a North County demand in terms of the biotech and high-tech sectors that's currently lacking in the downtown market, whereas UTC, Sorrento Mesa, Torrey Pines, Del Mar Heights, and Carmel Valley is sort of the nexus of where those companies tend to locate and where you generally have newer conversions and new properties there.
Yeah. So, well, let's turn to that then. The reality is that there's new inventory coming on. There's much inventory that's vacant at a level of having to be. And at the same time, as you alluded to, people, or as both of us alluded to, people are compressing their demand for office space. So I just want to sort of put this in perspective. I've had this sort of term, which I've called from evolution to revolution. This, in the office context, what that means is that some of the reasons for vacancies and for companies compressing their space have been going on for a long time. They've been subject of long-term trends. We do market studies in our firm and for private development clients, and we've determined that the amount of square feet utilized per employee has gone down dramatically. The metric we use is, we used to use in the last century was 250 square feet per employee. Today it's maybe 175, trending towards 150 square feet per employee. And that's because of all the obvious trends: efficiencies, disintermediation of administrative personnel, smaller computers. And what has happened from the pandemic, and this is the revolutionary part, is when people went home, companies and people realized that they could do a lot of their work, most of it, perhaps if not all of it, every company's different, from home. So that has changed the whole sort of metric of how much office space we're going to need and how people are going to work and so forth. And so it was sort of throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And what stuck, it seems, is this idea of what's kind of called flex space. Every company makes their own decision what that is. But by the way, the most fun fact I have for you is that here we are on a Zoom call, and a couple of weeks ago, the corporate owners of Zoom called all their employees back to their office space. I thought that was pretty ironic. But here we are in Zoom, working in our homes. You and I are both working out of our homes right now. I'm going to go visit my office later today for my once a month or once every 2 months check-in, but up in North County. But essentially, the pandemic sort of accelerated this change that was occurring anyway, because why not experiment during pandemic times? And what's come out of the pandemic, what has become, as you referred to earlier, as sticky, what is stuck, is this idea that people can continue to work from home, and that has dramatic impact in terms of state of the office again, from evolution to revolution. And I guess we're agreeing that the market, as we see it now, is sort of where the market is going to settle for the long term, you think?
Yeah, it's funny, if you go back to the beginning of the pandemic, right? And you saw, when you're talking about the space utilization per employee, it jumped up, and there was almost the idea that there was the thought that social distancing perhaps could hold a little bit, and maybe it's going to increase. And we saw it jump up a little bit there, but then starting in 2021, now it just started continuing that decade-long trend of falling space. So we're about 11% below what we were at the end of 2019 in terms of the space per worker. And that's even a sharper drop than it is nationally, which is about 8% drop. And I think it's sort of the recent Sandag deal at Holland Partners Project, I think speaks to what's happening in the market right now. You have these large companies. They were in 115,000 square feet at the Wells Fargo Plaza downtown. They've been there for 30 years and they're moving to brand new inventory and they're taking about 87,000 square feet. So they're shrinking their footprint by about 25%. So while a deal like that sounds good, it's a big new office lease in one of the brand new office buildings downtown. It ultimately is a negative event for downtown because there's going to be more space available in some of those, you know, and an 80s vintage property, which is what we're seeing.
What's interesting is that they're going to be paying less for rent because even though their rent rates jumped up, which by the way isn't going to happen with most tenants, but theirs jumped up to some extent, but the amount of space they're leasing is less. So sort of the play out of that is they're in brand new office space nearer to the water, more quality of life for their employees, in less office space, paying less rent. But what's interesting about that, and let's sort of push the conversation in this direction, is they're emptying what we have regarded previously as Class A, older Class A office space on a different part of downtown. In this case, what we call the B Street corridor. They're moving from the B Street corridor to the West Broadway corridor, which is sort of the new darling Class A location in downtown. So they're vacating more space to occupy less space in a different location. And just to sort of put a cap on that part of it, a large part of the 2.7 million square feet under construction and being finished right now in downtown San Diego is in a project which we call the IQHQ project, which is right on the waterfront. It's a gorgeous project, office dominated mixed use project with retail and restaurants on the bottom. And we don't yet know who's going to lease that office space, but I often get asked by reporters, what's going to happen to that office building when it's done? What's going to happen to Horton Plaza, which is the other big gorilla office building that's being built downtown, or some of these other, you mentioned the Holland project and so forth. These are really nice projects. And what I always admonish the reporters who call me about that question is, you're really asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, what's going to happen with that office space? That office space is going to be just fine in time. It's the newest, best located office space. There'll be a movement of tenants to that space. The real question that you want to be asking is what happens to the office space that they're vacating along the B Street corridor or along the Eastern Broadway corridors or other places sprinkled around downtown San Diego. And you can play this out in other parts of the region. What happens to what we used to call Class A office space? Maybe it still is. That where the tenants, when their leases are up, move to other spaces. Essentially, these spaces are being cannibalized. All right. And that was not the intent, for instance, of IQHQ. Their intent was to try to bring a very prominent cluster of business in San Diego, the life science cluster, to downtown. And unfortunately, their timing is such that may not play out because the life science industry is in a change moment as well, where there's less capital coming to it and there's less dynamics in that industry. And that will translate in not the kind of need for new office space, much less inventing a new cluster in a new location, which is very difficult to do. So what are their choices? Open it up to the spec office market. And then we get into this cannibalization scenario.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of right, there's sort of separate the Class A office space, which does include those 1980s, 1990s towers versus what's new. We've seen still positive demand over the past, several years for the properties that have built since 2015. Those are nice. They have amenities. They're creating a bespoke environment for their tenants, which is to say that I think it's less the class than more of the landlords and tenants being able to maybe make that single property into that very bespoke environment that the tenant wants, and that's going to be a good environment for that office tenant. What happens to those buildings is areas like downtown, it's going to be a struggle. I mean, we're already looking at a vacancy of almost 30% in Class A office towers down there.
Yeah.
And there's very little leasing that's being taken down in those properties.
Well, there's very little choice about what you can do with buildings. I mean, it kind of boils down to this. If you own one of these buildings that's going to experience these high vacancies, you have the following choices. You can either wait it out and hope that you're going to see more occupancy in the future. Obviously, absorption is going to be slow. The economic base, because it's, the buildings don't change, but the owners do, right? So they're going to own the new owners when whether it's taken back by banks or whether transactions happen without that kind of radical debt restriction. The base will be lower, lease rates will be lower. Maybe they wait out for the vacancies to become occupancies. That's one thing. The other is conversion. And we should talk about that, meaning that can office buildings be converted to what? Residential towers, some kind of maybe hotel, some kind of mixture of those. There'll be a lot of that that will be going on in these buildings. And the third option is tear down. And frankly, tear down of some of these buildings probably doesn't make a lot of sense, because as you said, these are not old buildings. I mean, we'll see tear down in the class B and C environment, because there are even older buildings that are even more vacant, that get even lower lease rates. We'll see tear downs there and new uses come there. But with respect to some of these still pretty well located class A buildings, which are functionally not obsolescent in any major way, they may have smaller floor plates than what we see in terms of the newest buildings, but people, companies could be accommodated if the demand was there. They're not going to be torn down. But those are the only options, right?
It seems like it. And I think it's going to be, I don't think we've hit it here in San Diego yet. It's starting to percolate across some of the markets across the country. But here in San Diego, there haven't been a lot of defaults on loans yet. A lot of properties haven't been going back to the bank. But once that happens and we start to see those buildings then getting sold for 10, 15 cents on the dollar, right, that's again what's going to prolong probably this general malaise in the market and make it more difficult for landlords that have held onto their properties, because that owner that now buys that tower for 15 cents on the dollar, they can say, you know what, I'm going to bring my rents down 30% below market so I can fill this property. And they can, because they went in with a much lower cost basis, much less debt on the property. And that's going to force the hand of other landlords to bring their properties down to market. And those landlords already, and we haven't even touched on sublet space, which is weighing on the market. And that's just another touchstone as far as what's going to weigh on the difficulty in landlords getting their properties to perform well in this market. Yeah. There's not much you can do with a property that's only 65 or 70% occupied right now and tenants not leasing space.
Well, it's in terms of conversion, which is, we're going to see a lot of play out in the conversion area. Some people suggest that a lot of these buildings aren't really convertible from, say, office building to residential. I don't happen to believe that. I think that we're going to see a lot more activity in that area. Conversions from office to hotel, conversions from office to residential, or conversions from office to some combination of office, of a residential, hotel, retail on the ground, that sort of thing. I also think we're going to see experimentations. I think we're going to see, let me set this up, because this is so interesting to me. At the same time that we're seeing this change in the office inventory, and particularly during the pandemic, what did people do? They went home. So let's stay with downtown. So what we found as we were helping developers, our clients, do market studies and feasibility studies on apartment projects, is that they were highly feasible and highly occupiable. And what people did is they went home to their apartments in downtown and they worked in their apartments. So if you, at the same time where the office buildings were empty during the pandemic, you could walk into any of these high-rise apartment projects, which are almost all full, very few vacancies, paying very high lease rates, frankly, order of magnitude higher per square foot lease rates than in the office market. And what are these people doing? They're in their home all day. They're in their apartments all day, or their condos to a lesser extent, and they're working. And when they need to take a break, they go into their high-rise social area and they get a cup of coffee, or they stay in their apartment, they get a cup of coffee. My only point is that not only is that aspect sticky, those buildings were full, office buildings empty, But there's no reason to suggest that office buildings can't be converted to de facto residential towers where people do the same thing. They work and they live in the same environment. And maybe we create environments where the office spaces aren't just some corner or some extra bedroom or the kitchen table, but they actually have dedicated large office space where people can actually feel comfortable in their home working in their offices. So my only point is that again, past is not prologue with respect to how people live and work. So the conversion opportunities are really going to be there. It's going to take some time to play out, and there's going to be some risk and some experimentation, but I really think we're going to see some creative things come out of all of this.
Yeah, and so far I think it's generally been at the smaller scale. I think tour bodybuilding is one of the only ones of that scale with what 225 billion, but that's an older, like 100-year-old building. But you're right, somebody's going to go ahead and do it, and then that'll provide a path for others to try to do the exact same thing and take some of these obsolete buildings and pivot them. Or they might do something like what Holland's doing, right? They're going to put a bunch of apartments on top of a much smaller office space on the bottom floors and kind of create that relationship, that mixed use relationship with maybe some ground floor retail, and try to reactivate that property and make them a little bit more competitive. But you're right, if you know, on the apartment side, if you build it in downtown, renters are going to come. They're flooding downtown right now, and that's
well, and they're flooding everywhere. We're seeing this, like we mentioned, the UTC market, the University Town Center market. If you go to that shopping center, I mean, we did some of the original feasibility work on that so many years ago, and that center has changed in many times, in many ways over the years. And today you see, well, one of your clients, CBRE Offices, has their office space there above retail and restaurants. The restaurant footprint's actually gotten bigger. The big old anchor buildings are being converted to Amazon offices and others, and they have a residential tower on the south side of the project, and they'll probably do more residential there. And then across the street, which is in effect part of the same sort of complex, an old shopping center is being converted to residential and office with way less retail as well. And there's a couple new residential towers across the street, all, you know, sort of approachable by bridges and roads, and people can walk to these spaces. So these environments do change. And I think some of what you're seeing there play out in places like downtown. You could go to Carmel Valley. I mean, Carmel Valley, which was a community that started accepting residents in 1982, didn't really have an office market until the 1990s. And today that office market is what, about 4.5 million square feet or so.
5, yeah, just about.
Even
And
bigger.
then you see that activity along the 52 or 56 corridor, building out life science space there.
Right. And why do those markets thrive? They thrive because they're in the suburbs, but they're acting like they're in the city, because most of the owners or people that run those companies, be they life science or law offices or anything, either live in that same zip code or nearby. In other words, they're acting in an urban way in a suburban location. They want to be close to where they work, and vice versa. And that's really, I think, what's informing this change that's occurring in how we work and how we live in America, isn't it? We see it right here in San Diego.
Yeah, I think One Paseo is sort of another perfect example up there, right? You have 300,000 square feet of office, 100,000 square feet of retail, 600 apartments, and it's an urban village, and it has everything that you want right there. Not to mention you have the single family homes for executives, you have good schools, you're close to the beach, you're close to pretty much everything in San Diego, which I think makes it a very, very dynamic region, which is also makes it very difficult to create a brand new cluster of that sort that is up there in downtown, because it's already well established. You already have the nice properties there. You already have the infrastructure and the households there with STEM degrees that fill those jobs up in the North County area, which is why it's just going to be, I think, a little bit difficult to attract those companies to come downtown. Are you going to shed your single family, residence to go live in an apartment? I don't know. Are you going to sit in traffic to go downtown all day? I don't know. I think that's sort of the great unknown to find out. I mean, we're already a unique city because there's not too many cities where we sort of have a reverse commute like we do here, right? And
From downtown to
North County, right?
That's been happening for a while. That's been pretty interesting. And that's sort of a demographic point in time where you have young people, affluent young people that preferred to live downtown, be close to sort of where the social and the recreational action is. But their offices or their labs are somewhere. So instead of coming this way, they went that way. And that continues even to this day. And I think the point you're making is, at least one of the points that I'm hearing you say, is that, there's different strokes for different folks, different people, there are lots of different lifestyles available, and people think about where they want to live, how they want to live, relative to where they want to work and how they want to work. And that's not going to change. And we're sort of in that adjustment phase right now. While we're seeing, just go full circle here in the conversation, while we're seeing all this high vacancy, reduction of lease rates, completion of a big cycle of construction that, at least for downtown, has been unprecedented. For the region, we've enjoyed lots of construction over the years. That's going to end soon. And at some point, nothing more is going to get built. What's built has to get occupied. And the way it's going to be occupied is going to change. And that, by definition, impacts the lifestyles that we're going to see sort of play out in San Diego. So it's not a negative story, is it? It's a positive story. It's a creative story going forward, where the region can thrive economically. It's just that we've got a lot of buildings that are going to go through some troubled times. And if you own those buildings, you're going to experience some economic stress over the next few years, and that's playing out across the nation.
I think you hit it perfectly, as far as some buildings are going to experience more pain than other buildings. It's, when you look at the totality of vacancy in San Diego, 50% of vacancy is only in 5% of office inventory here. So that's a lot of the market's vacancy in a very small set of buildings, and they're probably going to struggle, and we're going to adapt and figure out a path forward for some of these properties and redevelop, whatever the case is. The office market, though, I think in San Diego is in as good a position as I think we can be, given the circumstances about everything that's been happening, from the macro to microeconomic factors. We're a three-legged stool, from the military and innovation and tourism. I think the foundation,
diversified economy.
Yeah, the foundation of our economy is pretty strong. We might, hit some soft spots here if we run into a recession in the coming year or so, but I think we're well established, and we haven't overbuilt to this point. We don't have a ton of new space sitting on the market. It's coming to the market now, and it's a little bit more localized to the downtown market. It's not spread out into the suburbs so much at all, so you don't really have any, I think, weight in the suburbs to be concerned so much with. The thing that's probably going to take a little bit longer to play out, though, is about 55% of leases that were signed before 2020 still haven't come due, and about half of those are going to come due by the end of 2025. So it's going to be another sort of slow motion as that happens.
Next couple of years,
firms continue to right size their footprints, and it's probably going to be more the larger firms that are right sizing their footprints, because we're still seeing a lot of pretty strong leasing activity that's almost driven by small occupants that aren't necessarily shrinking their spaces. They're just able to move into better spaces now because they have much more leverage right now in negotiating with landlords. So
I'm excited about the future. I think you're exactly right. I think that like office quality of life is going to improve. There's going to be a settling of how people work, where they work. And I think it's, we're going to go through some, rough few years, and that's without doubt. But this adjustment phase will create new life, new energy, new opportunities in the real estate market, and ultimately contribute to a higher quality of life in the region. Before I let you go, I do want everybody to know that I'm going to continue this conversation with my partner, Nathan Moeder. We're going to talk about sort of the money side of this, what's really happening in terms of these loans, and who's going to get caught carrying them, and how that's going to play out economically. And then I also hope to have a conversation about how to implement change in terms of some of these buildings are going to go into receivership, that sort of thing. But those are all discussions for another day. Josh, I appreciate the time you've taken this morning. I think this is really interesting. Obviously, CoStar is the is the go-to source for all of us to understand what the numbers are. And I'm glad that my numbers were the same as your real numbers today. I was hoping we were on the same page, and we were. So thanks a lot for doing this. And I guess we'll talk a little bit later this week.
All right. It's great. Thanks, Gary. I appreciate being invited, and we'll see you soon.
You're very welcome. Take care.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.